Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Carey Mahoney, and I would like to welcome you to the ARC of Massachusetts webinar series. This afternoon, we are fortunate to have our Advocacy Alliance coordinators, Julie Heffernan and Herb Cabral from the Becker Center on Advocacy, tell us a little bit about how to tell our stories. So I'm going to hand it over to Herb to introduce himself.
Good afternoon. My name is Herb Cabral. I am the parent of a 22-year-old son named Joe, who has an autism diagnosis, and my wife and I have been his advocates for over 20 years now. I have a long history in the IT services industry. However, I've retired from there and have spent more time recently being an advocate for my son, and have recently joined the ARC as an Advocacy Alliance coordinator. I'm really looking forward to that. Julie?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Julie Heffernan, and I am the mother of 3 children. My son, Brian, our first child, is 26, and he has Down syndrome. We have a 24-year-old daughter and a 22-year-old daughter. I have been an English teacher for 30 years. My husband is a special ed attorney and civil rights attorney, and we've just been very active in the Down syndrome world from the day Brian was born 26 years ago. After 30 years in teaching, I've decided to leave teaching and enter advocacy. I think I want to use my skills as a storyteller and a lover of stories to use them for advocacy. And so that brings us to this webinar that we're presenting for you. In our role as Becker Center advocates, Herb and I are story collectors. We want to hear your stories and we want to collect them, and we hope to use them for advocacy as we lobby for initiatives, policies that benefit our children. We're going to begin now with a few quotes that I like about storytelling. The first quote: "Storytelling is the most powerful way to put ideas into the world." And before we move on, I think Herb is going to give you an example of just how this quote is illustrated, has been illustrated in his life.
Thanks, Julie. We had friends of ours who have a son with autism who was abused by a service provider. His mother just kept telling that story, as uncomfortable as that may have been for her, but she just kept telling it in the hope that it wouldn't happen to someone else, and also to prevent abuse in the future. And thanks to her advocacy locally and at the Statehouse, Nikki's Law, which will create a registry for service provider abuse, is in the final stage of legislation prior to becoming law. And I think that's a really, really powerful example of how storytelling can be really, really powerful and affect legislation and affect the lives of many, many folks.
Okay. Second quote: "Stories are memory aids, instruction manuals, and moral compasses. Sometimes reality is too complex. Stories give it form." And finally, "There is no greater power on this earth than story." So I want you to think about those 3 quotes, those 4 quotes, and we'll circle back to them as we proceed with our webinar. This webinar is based largely on 2 articles. The interesting thing is that they are 20 years apart. The first one, and I do want to say that you can find all the information you need to access the article at the end of our webinar. There will be a works cited page. But Glenn Gabbard in 1997 wrote "Family Experiences, Ways to Lead Change Through Telling Your Story." And I do want to read just this paragraph. This is from the introduction to that article. "Stories help us connect. Stories also reveal the details, the impact of systems on the daily lives of families and children. They are a powerful way to develop relationships among parents and professionals. These stories are what connect us to our work and to each other in meaningful ways. They deepen our understanding of individual and shared experiences. Stories often spur change in systems that seem impossible to understand." And moving ahead, I won't read this paragraph to you, but I will say that it's from a recent article, 2017, and Kindred Stories of Disabilities is a project in Tennessee, and I will read just this one sentence. It seeks to harness the power of the story and to make disability-related issues both concrete and personal. And in doing so, stories become tools for advocacy. Herb?
This slide is about what's the purpose of the story, and that can take a lot of different forms. Basically, it's a human right for everybody's story to be told. So it's always good to be able to tell that story for whoever you need to tell it to. The storytelling is a method for you to get what you or your child need. It's a way to effect change. So it's a way to take anger sometimes that develops from situations that happen and turn that into constructive energy. Instead of being mad, figure out how to tell your story to effect change on what's got you angry. It gives you the ability to influence public opinion, illustrating how policies affect families. People have to talk to their school systems. They have to talk to insurance companies. Storytelling is a way to adjust that public opinion and tell how policies are affecting your family. Helping yourself and others feel less alone in efforts to make change. As you tell stories, you'll find others who have stories that are very much like yours. In the case of, there was a Turning 22 effort last year for the budget item, for a DDS budget item for Turning 22 at the Statehouse last year, where a lot of folks who had those Turning 22 stories all gathered at the Statehouse, and those stories together became much stronger in that environment. Stories also help marketing strengths of certain ideas and bills to legislators and other policymakers. So that's an example of how you can effect legislation. Sharing information that cannot be easily presented by charts or graphs with others who don't really directly experience the same thing as you're experiencing. And we're going to have a story coming up that will be a great highlight for that. Raising awareness and promoting sensitivity to the experience and knowledge that grows from these experiences. I think that really resonates in educating people in the community. Talking about inclusion within your community helps with those stories to give examples.
Okay. So this is the story that Herb just referred to. And going back to the beginning of our presentation, I read the quote, "Sometimes reality is too complex. Stories give it form." And in this interview, you'll see this mother, Angela, talking about her daughter, Ayla, who has complex medical conditions with some physical conditions as well. And she was looking for or talking about the need for supports in the home. And so to a legislator's ear, they may hear complex medical conditions, oh, they need some supports. But it's not until you hear this 1.5-minute interview, this answer, that you really understand exactly what it is. This story of Angela just gives real form to the more abstract idea of family supports.
next slide is another quote that we talked about earlier. Stories are memory aids, instructional manuals, and moral compasses. I think specifically with regard to moral compasses, legislators think about the dilemma that this family is in about how they're not really able to get personal time and how that affects their family. So once again, I think another family story on family support.
Hi, Julie. Just want to make sure you unmuted yourself.
Oh, I'm so sorry. You're right. I did not unmute myself. Hi. Another important aspect is to find, not just have your story ready, but to think about your audience. Who are you presenting to? It's helpful to do a little information ahead of time. What's the age of your audience? What's their education level? Will you be speaking to men, women, a combination? And one of the most important aspects for us when we're presenting is to find out whether we're speaking to parents or professionals, legislators, lawmakers. And an easy way to do this is at the beginning of every presentation. Ask a few questions. Ask for a show of hands. How many people in the audience are parents? How many people in the audience are professionals? How many of you wear both hats? And you can just, by that, figure out where you should pitch your presentation. So a little groundwork goes a long way. We have a few pictures to illustrate this. In the upper right corner, there's a picture of my son. This is my son, Brian, when he was in 7th grade. And right behind him, you can't really see her, but that's his sister, Maggie, who's 3 years younger than he is. And the the story behind this picture is that Maggie was upset because at the recess, at 4th grade in the recess, a number of her classmates were singing a song. Day after day, they were singing a song that made fun of kids with disabilities. And that really upset Maggie, and she didn't know what to do. So I suggested that Brian come in and talk to the class. And it did the trick. When he came in and talked to the class and the students had a chance to talk to him, Maggie never heard the song again. And what's interesting, Brian still does do a lot of speaking to classrooms. And when he's in classrooms, the questions and the tone of the conversation, it's really focused on commonalities. At the end of the talk, students say things like, who's your favorite Red Sox player? What's your favorite color? What's your favorite color? What's your favorite ice cream flavor? So that's one kind of audience. If you go below that, you'll see a more formal setting for a storytelling. And this is a hearing. And for those of you who've done hearings before, this scene looks familiar. But for those of you who haven't, this is a hearing room at the Statehouse. And as you see, there's a panel of legislators in front. In the center, you have the chairperson. You have a number of people in the audience. And then you see in the middle, there's a little table in front of the panel. And that's where people who are testifying go to tell their stories. The screens on the wall in front of you show that you have 3 minutes to tell your story. Those screens tell your name, your connection to the issue, what organization you represent, if you represent an organization, and you see the minutes clocked down. At the end of that, you also have a minute, or the panel has a minute to ask you questions, so you need to be prepared to ask questions as well. And then on the left, the final picture is, again, this is my son, but he was part of a group that was sent to Washington, D.C. There were 9 young adults with Down syndrome, 9 self-advocates, and they were sent down to D.C. to talk to our legislators. The reason I include this slide is it's a small group. They met sitting around a conference table. And in this slide, you see Elizabeth Warren, Senator Elizabeth Warren, and they met, and so it took on a conversational style. They did go around the table, and every person got to tell their story. Every young adult told his or her story, but it was just a really informal, conversational storytelling time period, and there were questions, again, asked throughout the storytelling. So those are just 3 very different examples of the kinds of audiences you may have. Related to the pictures that we just saw, depending on your audience, depending on the occasion, the length of your story is going to change. If you've been asked to be a keynote speaker, obviously you have a full-length speech. If you're asked to speak in a classroom, you may speak for 15 or 20 minutes and then answer questions. And as I said, if you're speaking at a hearing, you have 3 minutes. You need to be able to tell your story in 3 minutes. So regardless of the length of your story, it's important to remember that your story has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the beginning is so important because that's the hook that gets the listener to want to hear the middle of your story. They want to hear the details, and they're going to wait for the end of the story, for the punchline. So in the beginning, you're going to introduce the setting. You're going to set it up. Where did it take place? Who's important? When did it happen? But then the plot really thickens in the middle. That's where you give your details. That's when you tell what happened. First, what's the major conflict? And also, it's very, very important to include the feelings that the conflict elicited. When we talk about our family stories, yes, it's important to tell what happened, but it also is very important to tell how that made our child, how that made us feel. And finally, the end. How does this story conclude? Was anything resolved? What did you learn from this story? And if, in fact, this is taking place as advocacy, if it's taking place in a hearing, this is the place that you would have your ask. This is the place where you would connect the story of your child, the story of your family, to the very specific legislative ask that you have come to advocate for. Herb?
Thank you. Okay. This slide is on presenting the story. There's a quote here: to be an effective storyteller, you must have something to tell, someone to tell it to, and the ability to make yourself heard. So having your story is really important. Sometimes the carpet is rolled out for you to tell it. Other times you have to make your own way to tell it. But it's always helpful to be comfortable with whatever material you are going to present. to practice with that material so that you're familiar with the material, to be able to relax, take a few deep breaths before you start if you need to. My son and I made a presentation recently, and he was pretty nervous beforehand, and I try to tell him, instead of being nervous, you can be happy that people want to hear your story. So sometimes just diverting that will help you as well. Project your voice with confidence. Speak calmly and slowly. Listeners require processing time. Establish clear and frequent eye contact with your audience. And that not only helps you connect with your audience, but it also helps you evaluate how your progress is and whether folks seem to be hearing your message and reacting well to it. If appropriate, you can put some humor. Sometimes that will relax your audience. Sometimes it may even relax you as a presenter as well. Also allow time for questions at the end of your presentation. That's the best feedback you'll get in a presentation is how many questions you get afterwards. Really tells you how well the audience understood your material and other information that they might want to know about the same material that you presented. So that's very important. In general, be positive, use action language. I like to say, tell them what you want them to do. Put words in their mouth, put words in their heads. When we tell our story about Joe, my son Joe's employment, I'd like to say, well, one time I was at one of his workplaces, and one of the waitresses came up and said, "Oh, Joe makes me smile every day. It's so great to have him in here." And I always think of that. That's something that's in my head when I think of how well Joe is doing at work. When I talk to one of the employers, he's really happy and wants to tell other employers. So we try to tell folks too the positive experience that employers have, so that's something that they can go out and kind of put words in their mouth so that they can use that moving forward. Julie?
Okay. All right. When you're telling your story, one of the most effective things you can do is have your family with you. In fact, if your son or daughter is able to tell his own story or her own story or part of the story, that's a wonderful way for legislators or people in your audience to get a firsthand sense of your child. Our Carey Mahoney, who's moderating this, our director of the Becker Center for Advocacy, tells a story from 20 years ago, and she was at a hearing for Joint and Human Services Committee, and they were looking at, the idea that they were looking at that day was they were considering providing respite based on a family's income. It just so happens that this hearing was held in a non-accessible hearing room, and yet families had brought their children and lined up in the front of the room were 8 children with complex medical needs. So the legislators were able to look at these family members as they were hearing the stories. Then, as in the middle of the hearing, another parent arrived with his child, and this child was in a full body cast. And this father was able to maneuver all the hurdles, to all the obstacles of this non-accessible hearing room and bring his child into the hearing. And Carey says 20 years later, that image right there is what sticks with her, and it certainly did the trick in convincing the legislators gathered that disability goes across all incomes. But if your family is not able to come with you, you can certainly bring or use props, audio visuals, pictures. A picture is worth 1,000 words. You just have to make sure that the picture that you're using is an enhancement of what you're saying and not a distraction. And of course, if you're using a PowerPoint, if you're using any technology, like I just missed the mute button on this technology, make sure that you're familiar with your technology ahead of time and you know how to work it just in case you do have a glitch like we just did. Here is a story, just to give you an example of a picture that enhances a story. You can find these stories on our website, the ARC of Massachusetts website, if you go to the link Supporting Families. And by the way, that's where the 2 videos that you saw earlier were taken from as well, the story of Angela and the story of Diane and their children. But in any case, in this story, I won't read the whole thing, but basically there's a 91-year-old mother named Marie, and she has always taken care of her 52-year-old daughter, Kathy, who has Down syndrome. This is more complicated in recent years because her daughter has been bedridden, but Marie is the person who provides wonderful care 24/7. However, in the last year, Marie has been hospitalized twice, and recently they found a lump in her breast. So clearly she's very concerned because of her age, because of her recent medical diagnoses. She's very concerned about the future for her daughter. And I love this picture of an older woman looking out the window. I think it just really captures the essence of that story. A similar example is this story about a family. And what family is, it's just a combination of friends and family. And Nina, the 8-year-old you see in the picture, has complex medical conditions as well as some other disabilities. And her mother relies on the help of family and friends, and her friends just show up. They don't ask what needs to be done. They just pitch in. But this picture shows the love and the joy in the family. And as the mother says, the last sentence here says, I am able to live life to the fullest and to be present for Nina, my son Dick, and my husband because of this wonderful circle of support. So again, this picture cuts right to the essence of that story. And one more example, again, you can find these on our ARC website, but this is Isaac's story. And this story was presented when there was testimony about the Turning 22 bill, about the bill regarding transitioning from school to adult life. And this mother felt that it was very important to see her son in action. She said her son needs support to work, but he can work, and he very much likes to work, and he very much wants to work. So she lets these two pictures tell the story for her. Okay. Herb.
Thanks, Julie. The next slide is What If I Cry? I made the joke when we were putting this slide together, it's less about what if I cry than when I cry. The quote here is, crying is, of course, perfectly acceptable. However, you need to be aware of the audience and their need to understand your emotions and your message. So even for the most experienced speakers, telling a story is going to reveal personal and emotional times that can be difficult for you to be able to present. So some of the things that you can do if those things occur, pause long enough to take 3 or 4 deep breaths and then go on. Sometimes it's useful to explain to the audience that you need to collect yourself and that you really want them to understand what you have to tell them, as well as how emotionally difficult it is for you. Mentally focus on something that makes you laugh. I think that takes practice for you to have something that you can kind of pull up like that in that type of moment. You can take a small squeezable rubber toy or some other object that will fit into the palm of your hand to squeeze to relieve tension if that's something that can help you as well. Avoid having someone rescue you by interrupting and interpreting what you mean. Take time to collect yourself and then go on. I think that's really important for you to be able to maintain control of your presentation to make what you're delivering more effective.
Okay.
And I can give an example of that too, Julie, before we move on about I was working with a slide and in a recent presentation, and it was a slide that I had used before as a picture I had seen before many times, and it was just something about that particular day that got me during the portion of the presentation, and it kind of caught me off guard that it got me like that. So I just had to, in that case, I kind of went with the emotion of, it was a slide of Joe and the 2 owners of the places that he works, and I was just so happy that Joe has those opportunities. And so I kind of went with that same emotion of, well, let's make sure that I tell them effectively about how great it is that these folks employ my son. So in that case, I just went with the emotion. Okay, Julie, thanks.
Okay, Herb, I think this is your slide.
Yes, it is. So to make sure that you follow up on your presentation, and following up, I think, takes probably a couple of different forms in that you kind of have to do a self-evaluation of your own presentation. So what were the key phrases of words that caught your ear? What were the most successful part of the presentation? I think that goes back to what we said earlier about making eye contact with your audience, so you're able to make some of these judgments. What was the most difficult to understand? In what ways should I change my story before I tell it again? That's always important to review what you've presented, also to make any kind of changes that you would make to sections that either didn't seem to go well, weren't received by the audience very well, or something that you wanted to add in afterwards that you may have thought of during the presentation as well. What were the major themes? How did the audience respond? What about volume and pace? It's always important to try to keep good volume so you're understood, and an effective pace so that your presentation seems smooth and you seem comfortable with your material. Did I use humor effectively? So if you've inserted humor into your presentation, did that humor work? If so, how might you change that? Did the story make logical sense? So as Julie presented earlier, did it have a beginning, did it have a middle, did it have an end, and did it sound that way? If there are evaluation forms that are available, if you're in a conference setting, it's really important for you to review those evaluation forms. They'll have a lot of input for you, both in how you have performed that particular day, as well as what you might add moving forward. Another thing you always want to do in a follow-up is try to figure out whether action was taken by the audience. And you can also, as I may have mentioned this before, if there are questions after your presentation, that also, I think, tells you a lot about how effective your presentation was. Julie?
Okay. Something else, just something to consider as you're thinking about telling your family's story, is as your kids get older, you need to ask them whether it's okay to tell the stories. You know, there may be a potty training story that you tell or something that you might embarrass your child as you get older. So you do need to run the story by your child and make sure it's okay. Along with that, I mentioned earlier that it's very effective to have your child tell part of the story if that's something your child is interested or can do. But if that's the case, and if your child is going to be speaking, you need to remind your child that they have a right. In fact, it's very important to keep any details to themselves that they feel private about. If they don't want to share anything, they have to know that it's okay for them to say they don't feel like sharing it. The story I tell along with this has to do with my son's school experience. I mentioned earlier that he does a lot of public speaking in schools, and the school children want to hear about his experiences in school. And in a nutshell, elementary school was fabulous. He had so many friends. The people in the neighborhood knew him. The teachers knew him. He was in the same school with his sisters, so it was a really wonderful time. Then he went to middle school, and this was the first time he ever got picked on, so this was something that was new to him because there were students who had come from other schools and didn't know him. But one of probably the most extreme incidents of this is that his collarbone was broken in the hallway of the middle school. And when Brian talks to schools, he knows this is an important story to tell. He knows they want to hear about bullying. He knows he has to tell them how important it is to stand up for your friends when they're bullied. He knows it's important for them to know that they have to be allies, but he simply doesn't like to tell that story. To this day, it upsets him. So when he gets to this point in his presentation, he usually says, "My mom's in the room. I'm going to ask her to tell this part of the story for you." So that's just an example of him knowing and feeling okay with saying, "I don't really want to tell that part of the story myself."
This slide has to do with an elevator speech. And an elevator speech is something you would use in a case of running into someone that you needed to speak to either unexpectedly for them or unexpectedly for you, and it presents a unique opportunity. So the speech would need to be short, typically a few sentences, summing up what you need to say about whether it's an idea, a proposal, a request. It's always really good to practice that speech because you're going to need to deliver that potentially an unexpected situation and be able to deliver it very quickly in that situation. As an example, I prepared something for some of my trips to the Statehouse last year. As my son turned 22, there was a lack of funding in the DDS budget that funded the turning 22 population. So I spent time going up to the Statehouse with legislators, speaking to them about that issue. And my elevator speech was, I'm Herb Cabral from Bolton. My son Joe, who has autism, is turning 22, and he needs your support for supplemental funding for DDS line item 5925,000. Lack of funding limits his daily routine and independence. Can he count on your support? And within that elevator speech, I mentioned that I'm from Bolton, so it tells my rep or senator that I'm a constituent. It also tells them what my son's diagnosis is. Normally a politician is going to be familiar with the whole turning 22 situation, and there's a need for supplemental funding. Using the specific DDS line item, I think really builds credibility in your story, that you've done the research and you know the technical details of that. The lack of funding tells the legislator or whoever you're talking to the effect of that lack of funding on your son's life. And the final line is a request for support. It forces action from the individual that you're making that presentation to. So that's an example of what an elevator speech would be. Julie?
And closely related to the elevator speech is what I refer to as a teachable moment. I'm sure that we've all been in these situations where you're just out on errands, going about your business, and somebody says something to you about your child that is just so uncalled for or out of the blue or completely takes you by surprise. The first time this happened to me was when Brian was just about 2 weeks old. I mentioned at the beginning that he's our first child, so not only was I brand new to Down syndrome, but I was brand new to parenting in general. And I should have been home. I'd had a C-section, and I really should have still been home, but our refrigerator broke, and so I needed to go replace it. So I was in Sears, and I was shuffling through, and I was holding Brian in my arms, and all you needed to do was look at my face and see how in love with my child I was. I was clearly happy. I was cooing to him. We were just having our little conversation as we walked along. When we entered the appliance section, I saw the mother of one of my students across the way. I was on maternity leave from teaching, and I saw the mother of one of my students. And so she came rushing toward me to see my new baby. But as she got close, her face just changed. She saw Brian, and instead of saying congratulations, what she said to me, this is the first sentence that was ever said to me publicly about my child. This mother looked at me and said, "Oh my God, didn't you have the tests?" And needless to say, I was stunned, and I was speechless. I was truly speechless. I didn't say anything, and when I got in the car to drive home, I was crying, but I wasn't crying because of Brian or because of the Down syndrome. I was crying because I hadn't stood up for him, because I was so stunned that I didn't know what to say. I was so taken off guard. A few months later, I was getting my hair cut. I was really welcoming the chance to just lie back and have somebody wash my hair and I could just relax a little bit. I had my eyes closed. And the hair cutters in the salon were talking to each other. There was a new hair cutter that day. The other hair cutters were welcoming her. And one of them said to her, "This is a great place to work. There's a group home around the corner, and they come here to get their hair cuts, but they don't have a clue what's going on. So you can do whatever you want to them. You can try whatever hairstyle you want, and they won't know the difference." And again, I was stunned. But this time, I went home and I wrote a letter. And then the next time that somebody said something, because there was a next time, then I said a sentence or two. And then my sentence or two became 3 or 4. And in time, I became more comfortable with addressing the situation and truly making it into a teachable moment. But I'm saying this with this slide. I'm including this quote, which doesn't have anything to do with disabilities. It's from an article in the Harvard Business Review. But I love it. Your ability to stand up for your truth is a muscle. And the more you use it, the more you exercise it, the stronger it gets.
Thanks, Julie. As we said at the beginning of the webinar, we are story collectors. If you have a story you'd like to share, either just for the sake of sharing it or because you think your story would be illuminating or instructive for legislators, please contact us. This is our contact information. Once again, every story is a great story. If stories can be matched to legislation, that's great. If stories can help educate your community, that's another really great opportunity to do some education. So put your stories together, contact us, and we'll make sure they get up on the ARC website for you.
One last note, November is National Caregivers Month. What a great time to tell your legislators your family's story. This photo was taken from an article entitled Caregiving, not just a personal issue, but also a legislative issue. Our stories do need to be told to our legislators, and this, as I say, is a great month to do it.
And there are these are dates that if you want to tell stories at the Statehouse, these are days that are really set up to do that. Supporting Families Day, February 13th, ARC and Massachusetts Development Disabilities Council Day on March 7th, Autism Awareness and Acceptance Day on April 12th. All three of these days, there are gatherings of both individuals with disabilities as well as their families at the Statehouse. The legislators are prepared that the folks with disabilities and their families will be at the Statehouse. It's a great time to make an appointment with your legislator, stop in, even if you just have to stop in unannounced. It's a way for you to be able to gain recognition with your representation. And the Statehouse is a great place to go. You can have a lot of fun at the Statehouse, too.
Okay. And as we said at the beginning, all of the articles that we referenced, the websites that we referenced, are mentioned here in the works cited. And I know that Carey will be making the slides available to you. Is that true, Carey? The slides will be available, or at the end of the presentation, or?
Yes. Also, we will be putting this webinar up on the ARC of Massachusetts YouTube channel, which will be posted on the Supporting Families pages. So thank you so much, Herb and Julie, for a terrific webinar today on how to tell our stories. They're very, very powerful, and we really hope that we hear your story very soon. So thank you for joining us. Have a great rest of the day.